It was a late summer afternoon, and the sun was shining brightly. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to relaxing at home. As I got ready to unwind, I reached for my wedding ring, only to realize it was missing. Panic set in, and my heart dropped. I searched everywhere in my small apartment. I looked under the couch cushions, checked the bathroom sink, and even rifled through my purse. I turned my bedroom inside out, but the ring was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of my love and commitment. Losing it felt like losing a part of myself. After hours of searching, I decided to take action. I posted an ad on Craigslist, offering a reward for anyone who found my ring. I described it in detail, the delicate gold band, the tiny diamonds that sparkled in the light, and how much it meant to me. I felt a mix of hope and anxiety as I hit post. What if someone found it? What if they didn't? A few days later, I received a reply. Someone claimed to have found my ring and wanted to meet in person. My heart raced. I was excited but also nervous. Meeting a stranger from the internet felt risky, but I was desperate to get my ring back. The person suggested a small, old-fashioned jewelry shop on the edge of town, owned by a man named Mr. Brooks. The next day, I made my way to the shop. As I approached, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. The building looked like it had been stuck in time, with its faded sign and dusty windows. I pushed the door open, and a little bell chimed above me, announcing my arrival. Inside, the shop was dimly lit and filled with an assortment of antique and modern jewelry. The air smelled of old wood and something I couldn't quite place. My eyes wandered over the display cases, each one filled with sparkling treasures, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the place, something that made me want to turn around and leave. Mr. Brooks appeared from the back of the shop. He was an older man with a thin frame and sharp features. His blue eyes were striking but had an unsettling intensity that made me uncomfortable. He nodded at me and gestured for me to sit at a small table in the corner. As I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Mr. Brooks began to rummage through a drawer, and my heart raced. What if this was a mistake? What if I was walking into something dangerous? But the thought of my ring kept me there, unable to move. After what felt like forever, he pulled out a small velvet pouch and placed it on the table. My breath caught in my throat. Could it be? I reached for the pouch, my hands trembling with anticipation. I opened it slowly, and there it was, my wedding ring, shining brightly as if it had never left my finger. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I held the ring in my hand, I noticed something strange. The table was cluttered with various items, watches, necklaces, and other personal belongings that looked like they had been taken from their owners. Each piece seemed to tell a story, but they all felt dark and unsettling. I glanced up at Mr. Brooks, who was watching me closely, a faint smile on his lips. A knot tightened in my stomach. What was this place really about? Why did he have all these items? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. I could feel the atmosphere of the shop shifting, becoming heavier and more oppressive. It was as if the walls were closing in on me, and I needed to get out. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the ring in my hand. It was beautiful, but my joy was overshadowed by the unease creeping into my thoughts. I wanted to ask Mr. Brooks how he had found it, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Instead, I just stared at the ring, feeling both grateful and anxious. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed the items around me. Each piece seemed to have a story, but they all felt tainted, as if they had been taken from people who had trusted Mr. Brooks. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked into the shop, lured by the promise of something lost, only to leave behind a piece of themselves. My heart raced as I stood up, clutching my ring tightly. I needed to leave. I thanked Mr. Brooks with a nod, but my voice felt shaky. He gave me a knowing look, and I felt a shiver run through me. I turned and walked toward the door, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. As I stepped outside, the sunlight hit me like a wave of relief. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I glanced back at the shop, its windows reflecting the bright summer day. It looked so innocent from the outside, but I knew better now. Winter was here, and the cold made everything feel a bit gloomy. The days were short, and I found myself spending more time indoors. One day, while scrolling through Craigslist, I came across an ad for an old movie projector. It was only $50. As someone who loved vintage films, I couldn't resist. I had to get it. I contacted the seller and arranged to pick it up. When I saw the projector, it was dusty but had a classic vibe that I loved. I loaded it into my car and drove home, excited to show it to my partner, Julie. She always supported my hobbies, but I could tell she was a bit unsure about this one. I set the projector up in the attic, a perfect spot filled with old memorabilia and antiques we had collected over the years. I dusted it off, plugged it in, and threaded the film through the projector. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. When I turned it on, the flickering images danced on the wall, and I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. The first film I played was a silent black and white classic. The images were grainy, but they had a certain charm. I was hooked. I could feel the warmth of the past as I watched the scenes unfold. Julie sat beside me, occasionally glancing at her phone. I didn't mind. This was my moment. As the days went by, I found myself spending more and more time with the projector. I lost track of time, completely absorbed in the films. Each one felt like a glimpse into another era, but there was something strange about them. The scenes were eerie, filled with shadows and odd figures lurking just out of sight. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, convincing myself it was just part of the old films. One evening, I decided to watch another reel. As the projector whirred to life, I noticed something odd. The film showed a couple walking in a park that looked just like the one near our house. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at Julie, but she was still focused on her book, completely unaware of the images flickering on the wall. The next film was even more disturbing. It showed a car accident that looked a lot like one I had seen last summer. My heart raced as I watched the screen, my mind racing with thoughts. Could these films be showing events from my life? I brushed off the idea as silly, but the seed of obsession had been planted. Days turned into weeks, and my obsession with the projector grew. I spent every free moment watching the films, even when Julie expressed her concerns. She reminded me that I had other things to do, but I brushed her off. I was captivated by the stories and eager to uncover more about the projector's past. Each film felt like a piece of a puzzle, and I was determined to put them all together. Then, one night, everything changed. I started a film that felt different from the others. The images were darker and more chaotic. I watched in horror as scenes unfolded that I recognized all too well. There was a shadowy figure lurking outside our house, followed by a violent storm. My stomach dropped. I had a terrible feeling about what was coming next. As the film continued, it showed a horrific event that hadn't happened yet. I saw a vision of Julie in danger, and my heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn off the projector, but I was frozen. The images were too compelling, too real. I had to know what happened next. When the film finally ended, I sat in stunned silence. I turned to Julie, who was now watching me with concern. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it clung to me like a heavy fog. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced with thoughts of the film and the predictions it seemed to hold. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. I started to see shadows in every corner of the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. Julie tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She suggested we get rid of the projector, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was convinced there was more to uncover, that I needed to figure out what the films were trying to tell me. As I continued to watch, the films grew more disturbing. They began to show scenes of violent events, each one more horrifying than the last. I felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the predictions that seemed to come true. I started to lose track of reality. The lines between the films and my life blurred, and I became obsessed with trying to change the future I was seeing. One night, I watched a film that depicted a fire in a house that looked just like ours. My heart raced as I realized the events were escalating. I felt the weight of dread pressing down on me. I had to do something. I couldn't let these predictions come true. In a moment of desperation, I decided to destroy the projector. I couldn't let it control my life any longer. I took it down from the attic and carried it outside, my heart pounding. I found a hammer in the garage and smashed it to pieces, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I thought I had finally freed myself from the grip of the films. But the relief was short-lived. The next day, I woke up to the smell of smoke. My heart sank as I rushed downstairs, only to find that the kitchen was filled with smoke. A small fire had started on the stove, and I quickly grabbed a towel to smother the flames. My hands trembled as I realized that the fire I had seen in the film had come true, just like I had feared. From that moment on, my life spiraled into chaos. Each day brought new horrors that mirrored the films I had watched. I became paranoid, jumping at every sound and shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen to Julie. I watched her every move, terrified that the films were predicting her fate. Julie was growing increasingly frustrated with my behavior. She tried to reason with me, but I was too far gone. I felt like I was living in a horror movie, and I was the only one who could see the danger. I couldn't let her out of my sight, fearing that the films would come true. I became a prisoner in my own mind. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise coming from the attic. My heart raced as I remembered the projector. I had destroyed it, hadn't I? I crept upstairs, my breath shallow. When I reached the attic, I was met with an eerie silence. The darkness loomed around me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I saw a flicker of light. My heart raced as I approached the source. To my horror, I found a new projector sitting in the corner, casting images on the wall. I hadn't brought it up there. I was sure of it. The films were playing again, showing scenes of my life. but this time they were even more disturbing. I stumbled back, feeling the walls closing around me. I couldn't escape the horror that had consumed my life. The projector had returned, and it was showing me a future that I couldn't change. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the fate that awaited me and Julie. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore the projector, but it was impossible. The images haunted me, and I could feel the weight of dread pressing down on me. I knew I had to protect Julie, but I didn't know how. Then, one fateful night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My heart raced as I rushed downstairs, only to find Julie standing in the living room, staring at the wall in horror. The projector was playing again, showing a scene that made my blood run cold. It depicted a violent confrontation, and I knew it was about to happen. I rushed to Julie's side, but it was too late. The violence unfolded before our eyes, and I felt helpless to stop it. The predictions had come true, and I was powerless to change our fate. The horror of the films had seeped into our lives, and there was no escaping it. In the end, I realized that my obsession had led me down a dark path. I had tried to control the future, but it had only brought us pain and suffering. As I watched the chaos unfold, I knew that I had to let go of the past and face whatever came next. But deep down, I understood that the horror was far from over. The projector had shown me the truth. Some things are destined to happen, no matter how hard we try to fight against them. I loved collecting vintage items and was always on the lookout for something unique. One day, while browsing Craigslist, I found an ad for a silent auction happening in a rundown warehouse. The listing promised rare items and intriguing finds. I felt a rush of excitement. This could be just what I was looking for. As I approached the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The building looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a rusted sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the heavy door creaking behind me. The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, with rows of old furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I felt a chill run down my spine as I made my way through the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The place felt haunted, like the ghosts of the past lingered in every corner. As I walked, I noticed a few other collectors milling about, but they seemed to be keeping their distance from one another. There was an odd tension in the air, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I brushed off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the nature of auctions. People were here to bid, not to socialize. I spotted the auctioneer standing at the front of the room. He was an older man, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it had seen better days. His eyes were sharp and focused, scanning the crowd as if he were sizing us up. There was something unsettling about him, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I was here for the items, not to analyze the auctioneer. As the auction began, I watched as he presented various items. There were old paintings, vintage toys, and pieces of furniture that looked like they belonged in a museum. I felt a thrill each time he revealed something new. I raised my hand for a few pieces, and to my surprise, I won a couple of bids. I felt a rush of excitement, but it was quickly overshadowed by an uneasy feeling in my gut. The more I looked around, the more I noticed strange things. Some of the items had odd symbols carved into them, and there was a heavy, almost oppressive energy in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but my desire to own these rare finds pushed me forward. I kept bidding, ignoring the growing sense of dread. After the auction ended, I loaded my new treasures into my car. I had won an old wooden chest, a vintage mirror, and a peculiar statue that looked like it had been crafted from some dark stone. I felt a mix of excitement and unease as I drove home. The chest was heavy, and the mirror felt oddly cold to the touch. I tried to brush off my worries, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. Once I got home, I placed the items in my living room. The chest stood out, its dark wood and intricate carvings drawing my attention. I couldn't wait to open it and see what was inside. But as I reached for the latch, a chill ran down my spine. I hesitated, feeling the weight of something sinister hanging in the air. I shook off the feeling and opened the chest. Inside, I found a collection of old trinkets, faded photographs, dusty books, and a few strange objects that I couldn't identify. Among them was a small, ornate box. It felt oddly warm in my hands, and I couldn't resist the urge to open it. Inside, I found a piece of parchment covered in strange symbols. My heart raced as I realized they resembled the carvings on the chest. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to go to sleep, but every creak of the house made me jump. I felt like I was being watched. I tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, echoing through the dark. I sat up in bed, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and silence. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. I started noticing things moving in my peripheral vision. Objects would shift slightly when I wasn't looking, and I could have sworn I heard whispers in the night. I brushed it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I became obsessed with the items I had brought home. I spent hours researching the symbols I had found, trying to make sense of what they meant. The more I learned, the more I felt a sense of dread. The symbols were linked to dark rituals and ancient practices. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Despite my fear, I couldn't let go of the items. I felt drawn to them, as if they had a hold on me. I kept the chest and the mirror in my living room, but I moved the statue to the attic. I thought it might help to separate myself from it. But even in the attic, I could feel its presence. One night, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror. It was beautiful, with intricate designs around the edges. As I gazed into it, I felt a strange pull. The reflection seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just my empty living room. The feeling of paranoia grew stronger. I started avoiding the living room, spending most of my time in the kitchen or my bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that the items were watching me, waiting for something. I felt trapped in my own home, haunted by the very things I had wanted so badly. One evening, I decided to confront my fears. I took the chest and the mirror and placed them in front of me. I needed to understand what was happening. I opened the chest again, hoping to find something that would explain the strange occurrences. As I rummaged through the items, I found a hidden compartment at the bottom. My heart raced as I pried it open. Inside, I discovered a collection of old journals. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with handwritten notes and sketches. As I flipped through them, I felt a chill run down my spine. The journals detailed dark rituals and sacrifices, all linked to the items I had won at the auction. I realized that the auction was a front for something much more disturbing. I felt sick to my stomach as I read about the previous owners of the items. They had all experienced strange phenomena, just like I was. Some had gone missing, while others had met tragic ends. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had unwittingly invited something evil into my life. Panic set in. I needed to get rid of the items, but I didn't know how. I felt like they were part of me now, and the thought of letting them go filled me with dread. I decided to take the journals back to the warehouse, hoping to find the auctioneer and get some answers. The next day, I returned to the warehouse, my heart racing. The place looked different in the daylight. It was even more rundown than I remembered. I searched for the auctioneer, but he was nowhere to be found. I felt a sense of despair wash over me. I had come here for answers, but all I found was emptiness. I left the warehouse feeling defeated. As I drove home, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw the statue sitting in the back seat. My heart raced, and I quickly turned around, but it was just my imagination. The paranoia was getting worse. Once I got home, I decided to burn the journals. I thought that maybe destroying the evidence would help rid me of the dark influence. I gathered them in the backyard and set them on fire. As the flames flickered, I felt a moment of relief. But as the smoke rose, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if the darkness was fighting back. That night, the whispers returned, louder than before. I couldn't escape them. They echoed through the house, filling every corner with dread. I tried to drown them out with music, but nothing worked. I felt like I was losing my mind. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. I tried to go about my life, but the items haunted me. I felt like I was being watched all the time. I avoided the living room, spending most of my time in the kitchen or my bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that the items were waiting for something. Finally, I decided to take action. I packed up the chest, the mirror, and the statue, determined to get rid of them once and for all. I drove to a nearby lake, hoping to sink them and leave the darkness behind. As I stood at the water's edge, I felt a moment of hesitation. What if the items were cursed? What if they brought the darkness with them? I took a deep breath and tossed the chest into the water. It sank quickly, disappearing into the depths. I followed with the mirror and the statue, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I thought I had finally freed myself from the grip of the unknown. But as I drove home, I felt a nagging sense of dread. The items were gone, but the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still with me. That night, I lay in bed, heart racing, listening to the silence. But the silence was deafening. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on. I filled my home with new items, hoping to replace the darkness with light. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The paranoia never left. In the end, I realized that some things can't be escaped. The auction had opened a door to something dark and sinister, and even though I had gotten rid of the items, their influence lingered. I was left haunted by the choices I made and the consequences of my greed. The thrill of collecting had led me down a dark path, and now I was left with the weight of my actions. I learned the hard way that some treasures come with a price, and that price can be far too high. I had just started to feel like myself again after breaking up with Eliza. It was early summer, and everything around me seemed bright and cheerful. The neighborhood was cozy, with well-kept lawns and quiet streets. I was finally free from the controlling grip of my ex-girlfriend, and I was determined to enjoy my new life. Eliza had always been the kind of person who wanted to know everything about me. She wanted to control where I went, who I was with, and what I did. It took me a long time to realize how unhealthy our relationship was, but once I did, I knew I had to get out. Breaking up with her was tough, but I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally free. One afternoon, I was scrolling through my phone, looking for something to distract myself. I stumbled upon Craigslist and clicked on an ad that made my stomach drop. It was posted by Eliza, and the title read, "Need to meet Jake, urgent." My heart raced as I clicked on it, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the message. In the ad, Eliza was threatening to reveal personal and embarrassing details about me if I didn't meet her demands. She wanted money and said she would expose everything if I didn't comply. I felt sick. How could she do this? I had finally gotten away from her, and now she was trying to drag me back into her control. Panic set in as I realized what this meant. I had worked so hard to rebuild my life, and now she was trying to ruin it. I felt a mix of fear and anger. I didn't want to give in to her demands, but the thought of being publicly humiliated was terrifying. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The next few days were a blur. I constantly checked my phone and looked over my shoulder. I felt like I was being watched. Every time a car drove by or someone walked past my house, my heart raced. I tried to go about my daily routine, but the anxiety was overwhelming. I couldn't concentrate at work, and I barely slept at night. The fear of what Eliza might do next consumed me. After a few days of torment, I decided I couldn't let her control me anymore. I needed to confront her. I gathered my courage and drove to her apartment. My heart pounded as I approached the building. I took a deep breath and knocked on her door. I felt a mix of fear and determination. I was done being scared. When Eliza opened the door, I could see the surprise on her face. She looked different, almost smug. I felt a rush of anger as I stepped inside. I confronted her about the ad and demanded to know why she was doing this. She just smirked and shrugged, acting like it was all a game to her. I could feel my blood boiling. As I pressed her for answers, things took a dark turn. She started to reveal details about how she had been watching me since the breakup. She knew where I went, who I was with, and even what I did in my spare time. It was like she had been stalking me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just about the ad anymore. It was about control and intimidation. I realized that I was in over my head. I had thought I could stand up to her, but now I felt trapped. I needed to get out of there. I turned to leave, but she grabbed my arm, pulling me back. I felt panic rise in my chest. I managed to break free and rushed out of her apartment, my heart racing. Once I was safely in my car, I took a moment to breathe. I felt shaken but determined. I couldn't let her intimidate me any longer. I drove straight to the police station and reported her. I explained everything, the ad, the threats, and how she had been stalking me. The officers listened and took my statement seriously. They helped me file for a restraining order against Eliza. The process was nerve-wracking, but I felt a sense of relief knowing I had taken action. The officers assured me that they would keep an eye on her, and I felt a little safer knowing that I wasn't alone in this fight. Even after getting the restraining order, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I still felt like Eliza was watching me. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. I would look out the window and scan the street, half expecting to see her lurking around. The anxiety was suffocating, and I struggled to regain my sense of normalcy. I tried to distract myself by spending time with friends and family, but I always felt like I had to keep my guard up. I avoided places I used to go, worried that I might run into Eliza. I even changed my routine, taking different routes to work and avoiding my usual hangouts. It felt like I was living in a constant state of fear. One night, I was at home, trying to relax with a movie, when I heard a noise outside. My heart raced as I paused the film and listened. It sounded like footsteps on the gravel driveway. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I tiptoed to the window and peeked through the curtains. My heart sank when I saw a shadow moving near my front porch. I felt frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? What if it was just a neighbor? I decided to grab my phone and slip out the back door, hoping to escape unnoticed. I ran to my car and jumped inside, locking the doors. I took a moment to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. I needed to get away from here. I drove around aimlessly, trying to calm down. My mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. I couldn't believe Eliza had the audacity to come to my house after everything. I felt violated and scared. I drove to a nearby diner, hoping to find some comfort in familiar surroundings. As I sat in a booth, sipping coffee, I tried to collect my thoughts. I couldn't let Eliza control my life any longer. I had to reclaim my freedom and my peace of mind. I decided that I wouldn't let fear dictate my actions. I would take back my life, no matter how hard it was. The next day, I contacted a lawyer to discuss my options. I wanted to make sure I had all the legal protections in place. I learned more about my rights and what steps I could take if Eliza continued to harass me. I felt empowered knowing that I was taking control of the situation. With my lawyer's help, I filed additional paperwork to strengthen my restraining order. I also started documenting everything, every encounter, every message, every detail. I knew that if Eliza continued to stalk me, I needed to have proof. It felt good to take action, and I felt a little less anxious knowing I was prepared. As the weeks went by, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I spent more time with friends and family, and I started picking up hobbies I had neglected during my relationship with Eliza. I joined a yoga class and began to find some peace in the routines. I even started dating again, taking small steps toward opening my heart. But even with all the positive changes, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would often glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see Eliza lurking in the shadows. It was exhausting, and I longed for the day when I could feel completely safe again. One evening, I was out with friends, enjoying a dinner at a local restaurant. I felt relaxed and happy, surrounded by laughter and good food. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving on. But as I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I spotted a familiar figure across the street. My heart dropped as I recognized Eliza. She was standing there, watching me. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I quickly turned and rushed back inside, my heart racing. My friends noticed my sudden change in mood and asked what was wrong. I couldn't explain it. I just felt a sense of dread wash over me. After that night, I knew I had to take action again. I contacted the police and reported what had happened. They assured me they would keep an eye on the area and advised me to stay vigilant. I felt grateful for their support, but I also felt a sense of frustration. Why couldn't I just live my life without fear? Despite the setbacks, I refused to let Eliza control me any longer. I continued to take steps to protect myself. I installed security cameras around my house and made sure to keep my doors locked at all times. I also started carrying pepper spray with me, just in case. I wanted to feel safe again, and I was determined to reclaim my life. Months passed, and while the fear never completely disappeared, I began to feel stronger. I focused on my career, my friendships, and my hobbies. I learned to enjoy life again, even if it was tinged with anxiety. I realized that I had the power to define my own life, regardless of what Eliza tried to do. Eventually, I decided to take a trip to clear my mind. I booked a weekend getaway to a nearby beach town. The ocean breeze and the sound of the waves helped me relax. I spent my days exploring, eating delicious food, and soaking up the sun. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom. As I walked along the beach, I reflected on everything I had been through. I had faced my fears, taken control of my life, and learned to stand up for myself. I realized that while Eliza had tried to intimidate me, she hadn't succeeded. I was stronger than I had ever been, and I refused to let anyone take that away from me. When I returned home, I felt renewed. I was ready to embrace life, knowing that I had the strength to overcome whatever challenges came my way. The fear of Eliza still lingered, but I no longer let it define me. I was determined to move forward, reclaim my life, and live it on my own terms. Finding a babysitter can be a real challenge, and it became even more stressful when I had to search on Craigslist. My name is Anna, and like many parents, I needed someone reliable to look after my young child while I was out running errands or going to work. I had been searching for weeks, sorting through countless ads and meeting a few candidates who didn't quite fit the bill. When I came across Lily's profile, she seemed like the perfect choice. Her profile was well written, and her references were glowing. She appeared enthusiastic, perhaps a bit too eager, but I was desperate for a reliable babysitter, and she seemed like a promising candidate. Lily arrived at our house on a crisp, chilly Saturday morning. Our home was a typical suburban house with a neatly kept yard. The nursery, while looking perfectly normal, had a strangely sterile feeling to it. Everything was in its place, but the room seemed to lack the warmth and coziness that usually made a house feel like a home. I showed Lily around, pointing out where everything was and explaining the daily routine. Her smile never faded as she listened intently. At first, her eagerness seemed like a positive trait, but as time went on, small things started to make me uneasy. Over the next few weeks, I noticed my child becoming quieter and less engaged with their toys. They had always been lively and cheerful, but now they seemed withdrawn, often staring off into space. I initially thought it might be an adjustment period or the result of the changing seasons. But as time passed, Lily's behavior started to unsettle me even more. She seemed to be always hovering around, constantly asking if everything was okay, and appeared overly attentive to every detail of my child's routine. It was as if she was waiting for something specific, which made me increasingly anxious. One afternoon, while Lily was outside with my child, I decided to do a thorough cleaning of the nursery. We had a family gathering planned for that evening, and I wanted everything to be perfect. As I was tidying up, I discovered a small, plain cardboard box hidden in the corner of the closet. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to open it. Inside, I found several shiny stones, a pocket watch, and a few other odd trinkets that didn't seem like they belonged to a babysitter. The items felt out of place, and I couldn't understand why a babysitter would have such things. My anxiety spiked. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting and that the items might have some innocent explanation. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. I decided to keep a closer eye on Lily and my child. The more I watched, the more strange things I noticed. Lily seemed to be always around, never quite letting my child out of her sight. She seemed overly focused on my child's routine, which made me increasingly uncomfortable. Then came the day that everything changed. I returned home earlier than usual from an errand and noticed the front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I hurried inside, calling out for my child and Lily. When I reached the nursery, the sight before me was chilling. Lily was standing near the crib, her back to me, and my child was lying still on the changing table. The room was eerily quiet. I moved closer, trying to stay calm, but my fear grew as I saw Lily holding a small pendulum, swinging it back and forth. My child's eyes were locked on the pendulum, and they seemed to be in a trance. It hit me hard. Lily wasn't just a babysitter. She was using some sort of hypnotic technique on my child. The realization was horrifying. I quickly grabbed my child and called the authorities. Lily was taken away, and the police assured me they would investigate further. While I was relieved that my child was safe, the entire experience left me deeply shaken. The nursery, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like a reminder of the nightmare we had narrowly avoided. In the days and weeks that followed, the impact of the ordeal continued to haunt me. I found it incredibly difficult to trust anyone new. The idea of leaving my child with a new babysitter filled me with anxiety. The house, which had once been a safe haven, now felt tainted by the fear of betrayal. My child slowly began to return to their old self, but the psychological scars from that day lingered. The experience taught me a hard lesson about the dangers of trusting strangers, especially those who would be alone with my loved ones. The fear of losing my child and the realization that I had been deceived was overwhelming. It became clear that I needed to be extra careful and vigilant in the future to protect my family. I couldn't afford to let my guard down again. As I began to look for a new babysitter, I approached the task with heightened caution. I researched potential candidates more thoroughly, checking references more rigorously, and asking more detailed questions about their background. I learned to trust my instincts and to be skeptical when things seemed too good to be true. The once simple task of finding a babysitter had turned into a painful reminder of how crucial it is to verify the trustworthiness of those who would care for my child. The psychological impact of the deception and the fear of losing my loved ones had left me deeply unsettled. I had to learn to balance trust with vigilance, ensuring that my family remained safe from harm. The experience had changed how I approached caregiving and reinforced the importance of being cautious when it comes to the safety of my child. Living alone in a modern apartment complex, I've always appreciated the simple, minimalist design and the secure access that keeps out unwanted visitors. My name is Mike, and as a young professional who values his privacy, I'm quite cautious about online transactions and anything that might compromise my security. It was spring, a time of renewal and fresh beginnings. The weather was starting to warm up, and the blooming flowers were a welcome change from the gray winter. I was looking forward to the season, hoping it would bring some positive changes. One day, as I came home from work, I noticed a small package sitting at my door. It was odd because I hadn't ordered anything recently, and the package was not from any store I recognized. It was from a Craigslist ad that offered a free gift, something I hadn't requested or expected. The package had no return address or sender information, which made me wary. Still, I decided to open it, thinking it might be a promotional item or a mistake. Inside, I found a collection of unsettling items. There were several photos of me taken from different angles around my apartment. Some were of me leaving for work, while others seemed to be taken through my window. Along with the photos were a few small personal items that weren't mine, things like a broken watch, a keychain with an unfamiliar name, and a pair of glasses that weren't my prescription. The package also contained a handwritten note that simply said, "Enjoy the gift." My heart raced as I looked through the items. The realization that someone had been watching me and collecting personal things was deeply disturbing. I felt a wave of anxiety and fear wash over me. I tried to rationalize the situation, thinking maybe it was a prank or some kind of mix-up, but the more I examined the contents, the more unsettled I became. The items felt like pieces of a creepy puzzle, and I couldn't make sense of why anyone would target me like this. I began to think about my neighbors. The apartment complex was relatively quiet, but there was one neighbor who always seemed a bit off. Mrs. Linton lived 2 doors down from me. She was a reserved woman who kept to herself. I had noticed her watching me occasionally, but I had never paid much attention to it. Now, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be involved in this bizarre situation. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to confront Mrs. Linton. I knocked on her door, my nerves getting the best of me. When she answered, her calm demeanor did little to ease my growing unease. I explained the situation and showed her the contents of the package. Her reaction was curious. She seemed particularly interested in the photos and tried to maintain a composed expression, but I could sense a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of satisfaction or maybe something else entirely. It wasn't long before Mrs. Linton admitted to being responsible for the package. She revealed that she had been watching me and that her intention was to scare me into moving out of the building. She felt that I didn't belong there and believed I was somehow a threat. Her plan was to intimidate me into leaving, using the items to create fear and make me feel unsafe. The revelation was shocking. The idea that someone had been spying on me and trying to drive me away was horrifying. I felt violated and deeply unsettled. My privacy had been completely invaded, and the psychological impact was overwhelming. The fear of being constantly watched and the realization that someone had been plotting against me left me feeling anxious and on edge. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment after what had happened. The sense of paranoia and the feeling of being targeted made it impossible for me to feel safe. I started the process of finding a new place to live, which was stressful and time-consuming. Packing up my belongings and leaving behind the apartment I had called home for so long was difficult, but it was a necessary step to regain a sense of security. The move was completed, but the sense of paranoia didn't end. Even in my new apartment, I found myself looking over my shoulder and being overly cautious. The experience had left a lasting impact on me. I constantly felt like someone was watching me, even though I knew logically that it was unlikely. The lingering fear and anxiety from the ordeal made it hard for me to relax fully. I decided to take extra precautions to protect myself. I installed a security system with cameras around my new apartment and made sure all the locks were changed. I even got a smart doorbell that would alert me whenever someone approached my door. I thought these measures would help ease my mind, but the feeling of vulnerability lingered. Every time I heard a noise in the hallway or saw a shadow pass by my window, my heart would race. I started avoiding the common areas of the building, opting to take the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid any potential encounters with my neighbors. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge and hyper-aware of my surroundings. As the weeks went by, I tried to return to my normal routine. I focused on work and spent my evenings watching movies or reading. I wanted to distract myself from the fear that had taken hold of me. But every time I sat down to relax, my mind would drift back to the package and Mrs. Linton. I found myself replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what had happened. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a news article about a recent crime spree in the area. The article detailed how several residents had reported strange occurrences, including packages left on their doorsteps and items going missing. My stomach dropped as I read the stories. It seemed like I wasn't the only one experiencing this kind of fear. Feeling a mix of anger and frustration, I decided to reach out to my neighbors through a community group on social media. I wanted to warn them about the potential danger and see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. To my surprise, several people responded, sharing their own unsettling encounters. It felt good to know I wasn't alone, but it also heightened my anxiety. I organized a small meeting with the neighbors who had expressed concern. We gathered in the common area of the building to discuss our experiences and share tips on how to stay safe. It was comforting to connect with others who understood what I was going through. We talked about the importance of being vigilant and looking out for one another. During the meeting, I noticed a few new faces in the crowd, including a young couple who had just moved in. They seemed friendly and eager to participate in the conversation. I felt a sense of relief, thinking that maybe this new community could help restore my sense of safety. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly began to feel more at ease. I made an effort to get to know my neighbors better, and I found comfort in the camaraderie we had built. We started a neighborhood watch group, which helped us feel more secure. It was a small step, but it made a difference in how I viewed my living situation. However, the fear of being watched still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be out there, lurking in the shadows. I remained cautious, always double-checking my locks and being mindful of my surroundings. I even considered installing additional security measures, like motion sensor lights outside my apartment. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange noise outside my window. My heart raced as I crept over to the curtain and peered outside. I saw a figure standing in the shadows, barely illuminated by the street light. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I quickly backed away from the window, my mind racing with possibilities. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation and asking them to send someone to check it out. I felt embarrassed for being so paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I waited for the police to arrive, I paced around my apartment, trying to calm my racing heart. When the police finally arrived, they searched the area but found nothing. They reassured me that it was probably just someone passing by, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The incident only fueled my anxiety, and I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake the feeling of dread. The following weeks were a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. I found myself avoiding going out at night and relying on takeout instead of cooking. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder and second-guessing every noise. I knew I needed to regain control of my life, but the fear was suffocating. One day, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of letting fear dictate my life, I would confront it head-on. I signed up for a self-defense class, hoping it would empower me and give me the confidence I needed to feel safe again. The first class was intimidating, but I quickly found myself enjoying the physical activity and the camaraderie with my classmates. As I trained, I began to feel stronger, both physically and mentally. I learned techniques to protect myself and how to stay aware of my surroundings. The classes became a welcome distraction from my anxiety, and I found myself looking forward to each session. I even made a few friends in the class, which helped me feel more connected to my community. With each passing week, I felt my confidence growing. I started going out more, exploring the neighborhood and meeting new people. I even joined a local hiking group, eager to embrace the beauty of spring and the fresh air. It felt liberating to break free from the confines of my apartment and face my fears. However, the shadow of Mrs. Linton still loomed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she might still be watching, even from afar. I remained cautious, but I refused to let her actions dictate my life any longer. I was determined to reclaim my sense of security and peace of mind. Eventually, I learned to balance vigilance with living my life. I continued to take self-defense classes and stayed active in my neighborhood watch group. I also made a point to check in with my neighbors regularly, fostering a sense of community and support. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone in my experiences, and together we could create a safer environment. As the seasons changed and summer approached, I felt a renewed sense of hope. I had faced my fears and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of community, vigilance, and trusting my instincts. Looking back, I realized that while the ordeal had been terrifying, it had also led me to a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. I had learned to appreciate the little things in life, like the warmth of the sun on my skin and the laughter of friends. I had found strength in vulnerability and discovered the power of connection. In the end, the stranger's gift had turned out to be a catalyst for change. It had forced me to confront my fears and take control of my life. I had learned to be cautious but not fearful, aware but not paranoid. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to face it head-on. It was a chilly autumn night in 2016 when my boyfriend, Jake, and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip. We were looking for a little adventure, and the idea of driving through the countryside under the stars sounded perfect. We packed some snacks, filled up the gas tank, and hit the open road. The highway was mostly empty, and the trees lining the road looked eerie in the dim light. As we drove further away from the city, the darkness closed in around us. The radio played softly, but I could barely hear it over the sound of the wind rushing past the windows. We were in high spirits, laughing and joking about our plans for the weekend. After a while, we found ourselves on a dark, deserted road. The kind of road that feels like it goes on forever, with no signs of life. Just as I was starting to feel a little uneasy, we saw something up ahead. A figure was standing by the side of the road, waving us down. At first, I felt a rush of fear. It was late, and picking up a stranger felt risky. But Jake, being the adventurous type, insisted we stop. He slowed down, and I could see it was a woman. She looked cold and lost, standing there in a long, tattered coat. Against my better judgment, we decided to pick her up. As she climbed into the back seat, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder, and I shivered despite having the heater on. I glanced back at her, but she sat silently, staring out the window. We continued driving, the silence in the car growing heavier. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. It was as if she didn't even hear us. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something about her felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The road stretched on, and the darkness seemed to thicken around us. I could hardly see anything beyond the headlights. Suddenly, I noticed the woman in the back seat. She looked pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and empty. I turned to Jake, my heart racing, but he was focused on the road ahead. Then, without warning, the woman started to whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent chills down my spine. I turned around to look at her, but she was just staring into the darkness outside. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. As we drove on, strange things began to happen. The temperature in the car dropped even lower, and I could see my breath in the air. The radio started to flicker, changing stations on its own, playing snippets of static and ghostly voices. I glanced back at the woman, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed outside. Jake noticed the weirdness too. He tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just a malfunction. But I could see the worry in his eyes. The atmosphere in the car felt heavy, like we were being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind us. Then, as we rounded a bend in the road, the woman suddenly sat up straight. She leaned forward, pressing her face close to the back of Jake's seat. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on the road ahead, oblivious to the ghostly figure behind him. I turned to look at her again, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes were no longer empty, they were filled with a deep sadness and a hint of anger. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. Just then, the car's headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, blocking our path. It was the same woman, but now she looked more solid, more menacing. Jake slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt just inches away from her. I screamed as the woman's face twisted into a horrific expression. She raised her arms, and I could see her fingers elongating into sharp claws. Jake tried to swerve to the side, but it was too late. The car spun out of control, and I felt the world tilt as we crashed into a tree. Everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in the passenger seat, dazed and confused. I could hear Jake groaning beside me. I turned to him, relieved to see he was still alive. We both looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The car was wrecked, but we were okay. As we climbed out of the car, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The air was still cold, and the darkness wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. I looked around, and that's when I saw her again. The woman stood a few feet away, her form flickering like a faulty light bulb. I felt a jolt of fear. This time, she looked different. Her expression was no longer angry, it was sorrowful. She seemed to be trying to communicate something, but I couldn't understand. I took a step back, pulling Jake with me. Suddenly, she vanished, leaving only a cold breeze in her wake. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I turned to Jake, who looked just as shaken as I felt. We stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to process what had just happened. We decided to leave the wrecked car behind and make our way back to the main road. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence felt oppressive, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a gas station. The bright lights felt like a beacon of safety, and we rushed inside. I could still feel the chill from the ghostly woman, lingering in the back of my mind. We called for help and waited for the tow truck to arrive. As we sat in the brightly lit convenience store, I tried to shake off the feeling of dread. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the sorrow, the anger, the emptiness in her eyes. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver looked at us with concern. He asked if we were okay, and I could only nod. I didn't want to relive the nightmare we had just experienced. As we drove back home, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the woman standing by the side of the road again. The memory of her haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed some kind of line that night. Once we got home, I thought I could finally relax. But the ghostly encounter lingered in my mind. I couldn't sleep for days, haunted by nightmares of the woman in the crash. I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for her to appear again. Jake tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We both knew something had changed that night. The road we traveled wasn't just a dark highway, it was a path into the unknown, and we had stumbled upon something we weren't meant to see. Weeks passed, but the memories never faded. I started researching ghost stories and hauntings, trying to find answers. I learned about the legend of hitchhiking ghosts, spirits that wander the roads, looking for a way to communicate or seek revenge. I couldn't help but wonder if the woman was trying to warn us or if she was angry for some reason. The thought made my skin crawl. I felt a connection to her, even if it was a terrifying one. Eventually, I decided to return to the spot where we had picked her up. I needed closure, something to help me move on. Jake reluctantly agreed to come with me. We drove back to that dark, deserted road, my heart racing with every mile. As we approached the area, I felt a mix of fear and anticipation. I parked the car and stepped out, the chill in the air wrapping around me like a cold embrace. The road was just as I remembered it, lonely and quiet. We stood there for a moment, looking down the road. I took a deep breath and called out, hoping the woman would hear me. I wanted her to know that I understood her pain, that I was sorry for whatever had happened to her. As the wind rustled through the trees, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was. The woman stood a few feet away, her expression softer this time. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. In that moment, I realized she wasn't there to hurt us. She was lost, just like we had been that night. I felt a sense of compassion for her, and I hoped she could feel it too. As quickly as she appeared, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the night. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, and for the first time since that night, I felt a sense of peace. Jake and I got back in the car, and as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, but I knew the woman was finally at rest. The memory of that night would always haunt me, but now it felt like a story I could share, a reminder of the unknown that lurks just beyond our understanding. From that day on, I approached the world with a little more caution and a lot more respect for the mysteries it holds. The hitchhiking ghost had taught me a valuable lesson about empathy, fear, and the importance of listening to the whispers of the past. I've always been into old stuff, like antiques and collectibles. There's just something special about items that have been around for ages and have stories to tell. So when I saw an ad on Craigslist for a vintage doll that was supposed to be in great shape and a total steal, I couldn't resist checking it out. I met up with the seller, an older lady named Mrs. Hargrove, at her antique shop downtown. The place was packed to the brim with all kinds of cool stuff, old furniture, jewelry, toys, you name it. Mrs. Hargrove led me to a back room where she kept some of her rare items, and that's where I saw the doll. It was a porcelain doll with rosy cheeks and big blue eyes. She had golden curls and a fancy Victorian-style dress that looked like it belonged in a museum. I had to admit, she was pretty cute. But there was also something a little off about her. Her smile seemed a bit too wide, and her eyes looked almost too lifelike. Still, I couldn't resist. I had to have her. I paid Mrs. Hargrove and carefully placed the doll in my car. On the drive home, I kept glancing at her in the passenger seat. It was probably just my imagination, but it felt like she was watching me. I shook it off, telling myself I was being silly. It's just an old doll, I thought. What's the worst that could happen? That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I placed the doll on my dresser. I noticed her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. Again, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, dolls can't actually move on their own, right? I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I could have sworn I heard a noise coming from the dresser. I sat up, straining to listen. There was again a soft scratching sound. I turned on the light and nearly jumped out of my bed. The doll was no longer sitting on the dresser. I scanned the room, my heart pounding. Where could she have gone? Then I saw a small movement near the door. I blinked, and the doll was back on the dresser, exactly where I left her. I must be going crazy, I thought. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. I'd wake up to find the doll in a different spot than where I left her. Sometimes her position would change, like she had been moved. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, only to look again and see she hadn't moved at all. The weirdest part was the dreams. Every night, I'd have the same dream. I was trapped in a dark room, and the doll was there, her eyes glowing in the shadows. She'd reach out to me with her porcelain hands, her smile widening until it seemed to split her face in half. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I tried to ignore it all, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the doll's presence was undeniable. I could feel her watching me, even when I couldn't see her. The atmosphere in my apartment changed, too. It felt heavy, oppressive, like something was lurking in the shadows. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get rid of the doll. I carefully placed her back in her box and headed back to Mrs. Hargrove's shop. When I explained what had been happening, the old woman's face went pale. "You must have disturbed something," she whispered. That doll has a dark history. Mrs. Hargrove told me that the doll had belonged to a young girl named Amelia who lived in the apartment above the shop. Amelia had been fascinated by the occult and had performed rituals with the doll, believing it to be possessed by a dark spirit. One night, Amelia disappeared, and the doll was found shattered on the floor. Mrs. Hargrove had collected the pieces and repaired the doll, but she always felt uneasy about it. She said she should have destroyed it when she had the chance. I left the shop in a daze, the doll still in my hands. As I walked to my car, I could have sworn I saw a face in the window of the shop, a young girl with dark eyes and a twisted smile. I blinked, and it was gone. I drove home in a fog, my mind racing. I couldn't get rid of the doll, not now. I knew it would only bring more trouble. So I hid her away in my closet, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The dreams continued, and the feeling of being watched never went away. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes I'd hear faint whispers in the night. It was like the doll had a presence of its own, and it was determined to torment me. I tried to go about my life as normal, but it was impossible. The doll had invaded every aspect of my existence. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus at work, and I was constantly on edge. I felt like I was going crazy. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a noise coming from the closet. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, the closet door creaked open, and there she was, the doll, floating in midair, her eyes glowing in the darkness. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, but the doll followed me, her porcelain face inches from mine. I could hear the whispers now, a chorus of voices, all speaking in a language I didn't understand. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks, but it was no use. The doll was everywhere, surrounding me, taunting me. I don't know how long I huddled in the corner, my hands over my ears, trying to block out the whispers. It felt like hours, days, a lifetime. Finally, the sun began to rise, and the doll vanished, as if it couldn't stand the light. I haven't slept since then. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, her glowing eyes and twisted smile. The whispers never stop, echoing in my mind, driving me mad. I know I have to get rid of the doll, but I'm too afraid to go near it. I've tried to give it away, to sell it, to bury it in the backyard, but nothing works. It always comes back, drawn to me like a magnet. Sometimes I wonder if I'm already dead, trapped in some kind of hellish nightmare. Other times, I think I'm losing my mind, that the doll is just a figment of my imagination. But then I see her, lurking in the shadows, and I know the truth. I'm cursed, haunted by a demonic doll that won't let me go. I'm a prisoner in my own home, my own mind, and there's no escape. The doll has won, and I'm powerless to stop her. So I sit here, in the corner of my room, watching the sun rise and set, waiting for the whispers to stop, for the nightmares to end. But they never do. The doll is always there, watching, waiting, ready to torment me for eternity. A few weeks later, I decided to take action. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I had to find a way to break the curse, to get rid of the doll once and for all. I started researching everything I could about the occult and demonic possessions. I scoured the internet, read old books, and even reached out to a local paranormal investigator for help. I was determined to find a solution, no matter how crazy or far-fetched it might seem. After weeks of searching, I finally came across a ritual that might work. It involved burning sage, reciting a specific incantation, and burying the doll at a crossroads under the light of a full moon. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. I gathered the necessary supplies and waited for the next full moon. When the night finally arrived, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I opened the closet door, bracing myself for the doll's glowing eyes and twisted smile. But to my surprise, she was gone. The closet was empty. I quickly set to work, burning the sage and reciting the incantation. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the doll to appear at any moment. But she never did. When it came time to bury the doll, I drove to a nearby crossroads, the box containing the doll sitting on the passenger seat. I got out of the car, the moonlight illuminating the deserted intersection. I dug a hole and carefully placed the box inside, covering it with dirt. As I walked back to my car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I knew it wasn't over, that the doll might still find a way to torment me, but for now, I felt a sense of relief. I had taken action, and that was more than I had done in weeks. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear any whispers, and the doll never appeared. I started to feel like myself again, like I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. I even slept through the night without any nightmares. But the peace didn't last. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I made my way down the hall, dreading what I might find. In the kitchen, sitting on the counter, was the doll. Her eyes were glowing, and her smile was wider than ever. I stared at her in disbelief, my mind racing. How was this possible? I had buried her, done the ritual. She should be gone. The doll let out a high-pitched giggle, and suddenly, the room was filled with whispers. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, taunting me, driving me mad. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks. I had to get out of here, had to get away from the doll. But as I pulled open the door, I saw her, Amelia, the young girl from the antique shop. She was standing on my doorstep, her dark eyes boring into mine. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice like ice. "The doll will always find you." I slammed the door shut, my hand shaking. I turned around, and the doll was right in front of me, her porcelain face inches from mine. I screamed, but no one came. I was alone, trapped in my own home, with the doll and the whispers closing in.